All right. Thank you, Christy. Thank you, Erica, for the very kind introduction and for organizing this. Um, I'm going to do about an hour of talking, but feel free to interrupt. If I do see you, I will answer your question. If I don't see you, I apologize. Ask it again during Q&A. Okay, I'll get started. So Taiwan Behind the Headlines. Just a quick about me. Christy has already given me a very kind introduction. I'm a historian by training. And I also help run the University of Washington Taiwan Studies program. I want to give just a little bit of a plug. We have a mailing list for all of our public events. We run a number of public events throughout the year. We will have one in the fall that showcases a number of experts about all of the current political situation with Taiwan, especially after the Ukraine war. And so that should be a big public roundtable. You can follow us on Twitter, on Facebook, and on Instagram now as well. Okay, so today I will talk first a brief history about Taiwan, what it is, how it got here. I'll very quickly cover Taiwan's relationship with China, with the United States. I'll go into two pretty quick studies, case studies about interactions between economics and geopolitics. And then I'll give some thoughts about what we're seeing currently in the headlines and what we should pay attention to for the future. So first, for those of you who don't know, Taiwan is an island off the coast of mainland Asia. It's here highlighted in this orange box on the Western Pacific Rim, north of the Philippines, south of Korea and Japan, and east of mainland China. Current population is around 23, 24 million. Landmass about a quarter of the size of the state of Washington. And by almost all indexes that are kind of professionally published, whether it's by NGOs or by political scientists that measure democracy, Taiwan tends to rank very highly in terms of world countries. This is one example from Freedom House that gives it 94 out of 100, which places it in, I don't know what the top percentiles are, but within the top few percentage points. How did Taiwan get to become a democracy? Well, it wasn't always one, but I'll start first with a little bit of kind of the ethnic/social breakdown. When we think about the category of Taiwanese, it kind of breaks down into these different categories. And I'll start first with the one on the right-hand side, in the Indigenous Taiwanese, which today constitute about 2% of the population of Taiwan. So Taiwan has had a long history of people who've lived on there for millennia. This dates back 2, 3, possibly even longer millennia, that is. This is a map of all of the different indigenous groups on Taiwan. Some of these don't exist anymore. Some of them have been assimilated over hundreds of years into what might be considered mainstream Han Taiwanese culture. Some of these still exist, especially those in the more rural and mountainous areas. And each of these groups is basically a mutually unintelligible language to one another. So they're all unique languages, and each of them have their unique cultures and basically unique society as well. Taiwan is an important part of the larger kind of what's considered the Austronesian peoples, which stretches all the way west from Madagascar off the coast of Eastern Africa, across the Indian Ocean, into archipelagic and mainland Southeast Asia, so Indonesia, Malaysia, Australia, New Zealand, indigenous peoples there, and then all the way east into Hawaii is all part of this Austronesian group of indigenous peoples. And there are some theories about how Taiwan's been linked with that. One theory is Peter Bellwood's out of Taiwan theory, which states that actually the Austronesian peoples originated from the island of Taiwan. So it's one theory among many. This is mostly based on linguistics because Taiwan is such a diverse kind of linguistic diversity in terms of its indigenous peoples. But it's not conclusive because we're dealing with thousands of years. Okay, so going back to this breakdown, we're going to go to the left-hand side. So what is known as Han Chinese, because they have roots tracing back to mainland China. This first layer that is below the 98% is split into Hakka and Hoklo. And so these are two groups of people that emigrated from mainland China dating back to the late Ming Dynasty, so about the 1600s. And this begins with what historian Antonio Andrade has called co-colonization. And that's because in the 1600s, the Dutch arrived in Taiwan and they set up a trading post in the southwest near present-day Tainan. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to establish a foothold for the Dutch East India Company. And they're trying to get into this really lucrative China trade of tea, silk, porcelain. And so what they want to do is they want to produce things that are demanded within the larger East Asian economy. And this is agricultural products and sika deer. Now, the indigenous Taiwanese are kind of co-opted by the Dutch, but they're not as cooperative as the Dutch would like. And so what they do is they encourage settlement from the very densely populated areas of southern China, just across the strait, especially the provinces of Fujian and Guangdong. And so these are areas where there's not a lot of arable land. And so the Dutch are basically taking away land from indigenous peoples and offering them to the Chinese, saying that if you come till these lands, we'll give you all sorts of benefits like no taxes for the first number of years, we'll give you these lands in perpetuity, et cetera, et cetera. And so this is an attractive proposition. And so a number of Chinese begin to emigrate to Taiwan over the centuries. The Dutch were the first among many different colonial rulers of Taiwan. The Spanish were there very briefly. The first Chinese rulers of Taiwan was a person called Zheng Zhenggong, who ran a very large maritime enterprise. And he sets up his base in Taiwan kind of as a rival government to the Qing dynasty that's established in the 1600s. The Qing dynasty doesn't like Zheng Zhenggong having all that power, so eventually they conquer Taiwan, they kick him out, and they set up Taiwan then as a prefecture under Fujian province for about 200 years. Then the first Sino-Japanese War between Japan and China leads to Taiwan being given up as a prize to Japan, and Japan rules Taiwan under the Japanese Empire for 50 years until the end of World War II, and then it's handed over to the nationalist government, the Republic of China, which I'll talk about now. So this very last group under Han Chinese, this last 13% called mainlander in Chinese, 外省人, refers to the Chinese that came after the Republic of China period, 1945, most of them in 1949, and for reasons I will discuss now. So the Republic of China was established in 1911 on the mainland, but at that point, remember that Taiwan is under the control of the Japanese Empire. With the end of the Second Sino-Japanese War, World War II, Taiwan is handed back by the Allies to China. And so it's ruled for a few years in the Republic of China until there's the civil war going on. Most of you know about the communists, which eventually defeats the nationalist government. And so Chiang Kai-shek, who is the dictator of the Republic of China, decides to withdraw his troops to an area where he thinks he can regroup and eventually retake China from the communists. And that's the island of Taiwan. And he does that for military reasons because Taiwan is far away from the Chinese coast. It's difficult for the communists to attack without significant amphibious ability. And so on Taiwan, the Republic of China sets up a significant program of Cynicization. So the rulers of the Republic of China basically consider Taiwan having gone off the beaten path because of 50 years of Japanese colonial rule. But they've kind of lost their Chineseness. And so they've implemented a solution of Cynicization, intense Cynicization. So teaching Taiwanese people that they are Chinese. So this includes, for example, instruction in Beijing opera, which is then considered an aspect of high Chinese culture. In primary education, in schools, Mandarin Chinese is dictated as the mandatory education of education, the mandatory language of education. So school children in Taiwan are not allowed to speak their native dialect, whether that's Hoklo/Taiwanese /Minnan or Hakka or one of the indigenous languages. They're all forced to learn Mandarin Chinese. Within curriculum, they're taught not Taiwanese history, but rather the history of China that dates back 5,000 years to the mythical dynasties. And so this is what leads Taiwan to be wrapped up in this idea of there is only one China, the idea that Taiwan represents the true China, and that is the Republic of China. Under the ROC government, Taiwan is ruled under a very brutal kind of period of martial law beginning in 1947. This artwork depicts the February 28th incident, which was an island-wide protest that was cracked down very violently by the Republic of China government. They sent in the military. And basically from 1947 all the way until about 1987, for 4 decades, Taiwan was ruled under martial law, under an authoritarian government that repressed all sorts of political activities. It wasn't until the 1980s that Taiwan began to democratize kind of miraculously after significant efforts by democracy activists, by students, to push the government to increase political liberties, and eventually by the 1990s to have fully free presidential elections and elections at all levels of government that today we see is quite resilient. Along with this period of democratization is also a period of decolonization. And what this refers to is kind of acknowledging this period of authoritarian rule under the Republic of China government and dismantling the kinds of authoritarian structures that were set up over the course of 40 years. So here you see an example of what's called transitional justice. This is a widow who her husband was one of the victims killed during the so-called White Terror, this period of authoritarianism after the February 28th incident. And so we do see that Taiwan is attempting to address all the different kinds of social injustices that were carried out under the martial law period. So part of decolonization is also what is sometimes called indigenization or nativization or Taiwanization. And this is the reemergence of a Taiwanese identity that had been repressed under Cynicization, under this process of turning all Taiwanese into Chinese. And so ever since martial law was lifted, ever since Taiwan became democratic, I think that Taiwan has become a pluralistic society where people are expressing not only their political beliefs, but also their beliefs about how they identify themselves. And so we see this with polling, which is really important. This is a poll that's conducted by the National Tsinghua University Election Studies Center. It's been conducted ever since 1992, and we see something that is very significant here. If you look at this green line, this is an answer to a question, do you identify as Chinese, as Taiwanese, as both, or no response? And in 1992, if you look at this green line, only about 17.6% of the population identified as Taiwanese and only as Taiwanese. You can see in 92, the majority of people identified as both Taiwanese and Chinese. But over time, this green line has grown dramatically to where June of 2022, 63.7% of people in Taiwan identify as Taiwanese and only as Taiwanese. And you can see the blue line, people who identify as Chinese and only as Chinese, used to be a quarter of the population, now is 2.4%. That is very, very small. And so you see a very dramatic shift in how Taiwanese people identify themselves. And this has significant consequences for the politics of Taiwan. One of the most major political movements in the past 10 years in Taiwan was the Sunflower Movement. This was a youth student-led movement, protests in Taipei that occupied the legislative yuan. And the Sunflower Movement, I would argue, most scholars would argue, was a reaction to, one, the attack of democratic institutions. It was the kind of immediate precursors because there was significant legislation being moved in legislative yuan without public review. So it was being passed in legislative yuan through what was termed a black box process, where it wasn't given proper public review so that the public could give its input into the law. And this law very specifically was about increased economic ties with China. And so that's the second part, which is that Taiwanese people are deeply concerned about its relationship with China. And one of the scholars that studies Taiwan, Lin, in her book, I think states it very well. She stated that over time, Taiwanese have come to regard Taiwan as the community whose interests should be promoted, and more have come to view China as the other that challenges those interests. So this leads us to the current political landscape in Taiwan. The current president is President Tsai Ing-wen. You see her here. She's serving her second term until 2024. She is a candidate or a politician from the Democratic Progressive Party, or the DPP. The DPP has its roots from the 1980s democratization. So they were part of this democratization push. And they were the first major party to emerge in opposition to the nationalist government. The nationalist government, the Kuomintang, the Nationalist Party, has transformed from basically a party state that controlled everything to basically a political party that exists in a democratic system and runs candidates for elections. So it's kind of transformed from an authoritarian government into one of two major parties within a fully democratic system. The most recent KMT Kuomintang candidate was Han Kuo-yu. He ran against Tsai Ing-wen in the last presidential elections. And he ran on a campaign of kind of make Taiwan great again. So he was a mayor of Kaohsiung, which was a city that was very prosperous during Taiwan's economic heyday during the 1980s, and has seen kind of a hollowing out because of kind of deindustrialization in Taiwan. And so he's running on a campaign of nostalgia, of arguing that he'll bring back the glory days of Taiwan under Kuomintang rule, under the late years of Kuomintang rule, which indeed saw quite a bit of economic prosperity. There are also a number of third parties that are not aligned with the two major parties. Some of them are kind of working with them on a coalition basis. So to describe this, we utilize the main colors. So there's the Pan-Green coalition, which aligns with the DPP, and there's the Pan-Blue coalition, which aligns with the KMT. Some of these are not aligned with either, and so they're more centrist. And so you can kind of see that kind of in the presidential elections, it's mainly between the two parties, but in the legislative yuan, in the elected lawmakers, you do see a number of third-party candidates who do get elected into the legislative yuan. Okay, so I'll start with China's relationship with Taiwan. And you might have seen, I'm sure you've all seen the headlines recently. This is from last May in The Economist. It said that Taiwan is the most dangerous place on earth. New York Times earlier this year, after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, has asked, is Taiwan next? And in the wake of Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan, we did see a number of aggressive kind of military exercises being utilized by Beijing against Taipei, including launching missiles very close off the shores of inhabited areas of Taiwan. And plenty of experts are publishing articles every day about how this is the beginning of a new Taiwan Strait crisis and perhaps a precursor to war. So what's the reason for this? From Beijing's perspective, it sees Taiwan as a part of China, that it believes it should rule. And so this is a recent speech from Xi Jinping last year. No one should underestimate the Chinese people's staunch determination, firm will, and strong ability to defend national sovereignty and territorial integrity. Of course, both of these refer to Taiwan implicitly. The historical task of complete reunification of the motherland must be fulfilled and will definitely be fulfilled. Again, reunification is referring to Taiwan, which in Beijing's perspective was taken from China forcefully by outside powers. And so we also see that under Xi Jinping, there's a significant change in how the Chinese Communist Party utilizes certain kinds of politics as a form of legitimacy. And so Carrie Brown and Callie Hui have made this argument that under Xi Jinping, nationalism is a new source of legitimacy. And I think this is true. Xi Jinping has really leaned into nationalism much more than previous rulers of the PRC have. And I think this is for a number of reasons. One is that kind of the economic reason is no longer as reliable as it was in past years. But nationalism is proven to be a solid way for Xi Jinping to build support and to build the coalition within the government behind him. We see this increasingly aggressive form of politics result in also increasingly aggressive policies, including the national security law, which was passed very much in reaction to the Hong Kong protests that emerged in the past 5 years or so. And it also leads us to understanding how the PRC is also within this triangular relationship between the United States and Taiwan. And so this is a kind of classical 1970s political science theory about a triangular relationship. When any particular leg of this relationship is weak, we see a corresponding increase in strength in the other sides of the triangle. And so today we see a very contentious relationship between China and the United States and between China and Taiwan. And so conversely, we see instead a very strong growing relationship between the United States and Taiwan. I think this is an accurate description of where we are today. From Beijing's perspective, of course, it sees the so-called New Cold War as the United States, here depicted by Uncle Sam, utilizing Taiwan as a chess piece in its kind of global, kind of hegemonic ambitions. And we'll talk more about this. Okay, I want to go into a couple very specific case studies that I think illustrate more concretely some of the dynamics that I've described. And this will also discuss quite a bit about economic ties, which are very complicated and complicated by political ties. So one question that some scholars have asked is, can economic ties between the United States, China, and Taiwan potentially temper some of the conflicts that we're seeing? Taiwan, of course, is a major global kind of powerhouse in terms of its economy. If we look at GDP per capita, in the 1950s, it was very, very low, I think around 1,000 US dollars per capita. That's grown about 25-fold to where it's about 25,000 US dollars per capita today for its GDP. If within multiple kind of indexes for measuring GDP, Taiwan ranks about 21st. So this is, I think, the IMF rankings of countries. It's a very large economy, and it's not far behind some also very large economies, such as Mexico and Australia, South Korea. There, Taiwan's at the bottom. Okay, I want to focus on one company that has been in the headlines quite a bit. That is TSMC, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company. And TSMC is here. This is kind of Bloomberg has created this visual depiction of different companies that do semiconductor manufacturing / design. And it's broken down by region, so the United States, Europe, and Asia. If you notice the colors, you'll see that TSMC is all pink, and there aren't many circles that are all pink. Pink means that this company is a foundry. And so what is a foundry? If you look at this process of how semiconductors are typically manufactured, you have on the left-hand side design. So engineers design a semiconductor. Then there's manufacturing. So it goes into a factory and it's produced. And then there's testing and assembly to make sure that everything is up to spec. TSMC is a foundry, which means that the foundry only does manufacturing. It doesn't do design, and it doesn't do testing and assembly. And what this allows is for the foundry to focus very exclusively on, one, being able to produce semiconductors at high yields and on really low die sizes. So die size refers to the size of the chip, aka lithography. The smaller the chip, the faster it can run at lower heat, which is really good. And so the other aspect is that foundries can really focus on cost effectiveness, that it can produce for other companies, and it can really cut costs so that the margins are then passed on to other companies. If we go back to this chart, you'll see that most US companies here on the left, like NVIDIA, AMD, Qualcomm, they're in blue, which means that they're fabless. Fabless meaning that they don't have their own fabrication facilities. They're purely design firms, so they only have engineers who design chips, and they're dependent upon companies like TSMC to produce chips for them because they don't have their own manufacturing facilities. And so you can see that TSMC includes a number of really important US firms like AMD, Qualcomm, NVIDIA, Apple as its clients. If we break down the foundry industry as purely just looking only at companies that are foundries, you'll notice that TSMC occupies over 50% of the market. And the next closest competitor is Samsung, which is not just a foundry, it's also an IDM, an integrated design manufacturer. So it does everything. And so this represents a significant kind of almost not quite a monopoly, but a significant player within the global foundry market. And it also represents a significant kind of dependency for US firms. So this is why the United States is very concerned about both TSMC and about Taiwan. This is a quote from a Financial Times article where you can see one of these experts, Mr. Hutchinson, is quoted saying that Taiwan's so-called Silicon Shield makes it the 51st US state, referring to the theory that the country's leadership in chip technology is its best defense against aggression from China. The US needs to protect Taiwan. It can't afford to lose it to China. And that's because of how important TSMC and Taiwan-based foundries are to global semiconductor manufacturing, especially US semiconductor manufacturing, where you can see from the pandemic, where when you have any kind of hiccup in semiconductor supply chains, well, everything goes awry. And this is the reason why the United States, the Biden administration, one of its priorities when it took power was to prioritize a bill that would bring semiconductor manufacturing back within US borders. And this was just passed. So this is the CHIPS Act, which I'm sure most of you have heard about. The CHIPS Act has incentivized global manufacturing to build fabrication facilities in the United States. And this includes TSMC, which is now almost, I think, operational for its new Arizona plant, which is a big deal. This is a major investment from TSMC, but it's also a part of US plans to make sure that if Taiwan suffers a blockade or worse, any other kind of military action, that it wouldn't disrupt supply chains for semiconductors. And you can see how Taiwan is also weaponized in terms of its relationship with China, because when the Trump administration passed that trade ban, it also affected TSMC. And so TSMC stopped selling chips to Huawei, which is a major, Huawei is a major player in terms of the international IT market, produces cell phones and other kinds of telecommunications equipment. And so companies like Huawei, which used to also contract with TSMC, were then forced to find other companies to produce for them. Okay, so I've talked about how ties combined Taiwan and the United States. Let's talk about the other aspect, which is ties between Taiwan and China. So the United States is a major trading partner of Taiwan, but actually by volume, by percentage of trade, it's dwarfed by China, which is by far and large the largest trading partner for Taiwan. And what this does is it creates a significant dependency for Taiwan on China, which also happens to be its greatest geopolitical threat. And we can see how this plays out with another example of a major Taiwanese company, Hon Hai, also known as Foxconn. Foxconn is known for being the assembler of the iPhone for Apple. It has, this is a breakdown from Patently Apple. It's of the iPhone 10, but regardless, iPhone 13, iPhone 14, it largely looks the same. You'll see that the one company that's involved, that's in charge of assembling all of these different components is Foxconn. It also does a little bit of other stuff like stainless steel frames. Most of Foxconn's facilities, manufacturing facilities, are located in mainland China. So this is kind of a geographic map of all of Foxconn's, Hon Hai's manufacturing facilities. The larger the circle, the bigger the facility. And the majority, these blue circles, are in China, in actually low-cost labor markets like Zhengzhou, where they're really trying to cut all of the kind of profit margin that they can. I'm sorry, they're trying to cut costs as much as they can so that they can sell based on um, sell to Apple based upon cutting costs. Um, this is a significant kind of dependency for Taiwan. So very obviously, if any kind of conflict breaks out, one of its largest firms, Foxconn, is very much exposed to the potential for military conflict to completely disrupt their supply chains. And so what we're also seeing from Taiwan is their companies are going elsewhere to kind of move away from their dependency upon the mainland Chinese labor market. So here, this is from 2020, you see that there's a greater increased investment from Foxconn and from other contractors for Apple to build manufacturing facilities in Southeast Asia. Very specifically here is mentioned Vietnam, which since the pandemic has really benefited from the increase in manufacturing being relocated into Vietnam outside of China. Taiwan, of course, has also been a major beneficiary. Okay, so let's move into this final section where I'll talk about kind of what we're seeing in the headlines today and what we should pay attention to in the near future. One is Taiwan's international isolation. This is not new. This is an old story. Taiwan doesn't have many countries that officially recognize Taiwan as a country. So officially, Taiwan is the Republic of China. This is the most recent map I could find. It says 17 nations still have official relations with Taiwan. That's not accurate. It's 14. And that's because Beijing, ever since Tsai Ing-wen has come to power and Xi Jinping has come to power, Beijing does not like Tsai Ing-wen. She's from they prefer to deal with somebody from the Kuomintang, from the Nationalist Party. So they kind of punish Taipei by picking off their diplomatic allies. And so this is the most recent news from December of last year that Beijing has encouraged, succeeded in having Nicaragua shift recognition away from the Republic of China to recognize the People's Republic of China instead. And so ever since this map was produced, 3 more nations were lost to Beijing. That's the Solomon Islands, Kiribati, and Nicaragua. What we're seeing is something that Beijing really doesn't like. And when we think about how Taiwan is represented abroad, because of the so-called kind of one China policy that Beijing kind of enforces and muscles upon the rest of the world, it doesn't like it when Taiwan uses the name Taiwan. So, for example, in Seattle, we have a consulate from Taiwan. It's called the Taipei Economic and Cultural Office. It's not called the Taiwan Representative Office or Taiwan Consulate. Somaliland is an unrecognized state in Africa. It's technically recognized as a part of Somalia, but it also has its own de facto government. It has its own elected officials, and it sees itself as a separate government from Somalia. So in some ways, it runs on a kind of parallel as Taiwan. And they found some common ground. And as a result, in 2020, they exchanged representative offices. And the name of this representative office is not a Taipei representative office, it's a Taiwan representative office. And this has set off alarm bells in Beijing, have very aggressively attempted to both kind of convince Somaliland to move away from Taipei, and also put significant pressure on Somalia, which for very obvious reasons is a very close ally of Beijing, to get Somaliland to cancel this representative office. And of course, they haven't been successful because what incentive does Somaliland have to do that? They very much like having Taiwan as a friend. The other aspect is Lithuania, which ever since about a few years ago has been pursuing what it's called a values-based foreign policy. As we all know, Russia has been on a very aggressive kind of warmongering series of events ever since Chechnya and Georgia. Lithuania has been very concerned about Russia, and it sees Beijing very much within this frame of an authoritarian government, much like its own experience with the Soviet Union. And so Lithuania has actually conducted increasingly friendly relations with Taiwan. And just, I think, this month has, the plans were announced a year ago, but just this month has opened up a Taiwan representative office as well. The difference between Lithuania and Somaliland, I'm sorry, is that Lithuania is a recognized country in the United Nations. Somaliland is not. This is very, very concerning for Beijing, and they have used all sorts of means to exert pressure on Lithuania, including pressuring German companies, so not Lithuanian companies, German companies that deal with Chinese companies, saying that we will cut you off unless you exert pressure within the European Union upon Lithuania to pull back its representative office. And there's a period when late last year, when if you're looking at the polling in Lithuania, that even though the so-called values-based foreign policy is very popular among the Lithuanian public, the Chinese pressure was unpopular. I mean, it was really getting to the Lithuanian public, where they were beginning to have polls that said that people don't want Taiwan to open a representative office. Well, then Russia invaded the Ukraine, and that has changed everything, basically. So I think the Taiwan representative office will be here to stay. And we all know the reason why. This is the picture of Lithuania's democracy movement, same time period as Taiwan, when it kind of sought independence from the Soviet Union. Okay, second to last thing to keep in mind, strategic ambiguity. So strategic ambiguity refers to the kind of unofficial US policy, but long-standing US policy towards Taiwan and China. It is ambiguous because the United States does not outline a clear commitment to defend Taiwan. It leaves its policy with regards to what might happen in Taiwan purposely ambiguous, because what this does is it allows it a great deal of flexibility to determine how it seeks to intervene. And also it provides what's called dual deterrence. The kind of unknown aspect of the United States deters Beijing from acting rashly. So Beijing doesn't exactly know what it might do that might trigger a US reaction. And it's dual deterrence because it also deters Taipei. So it discourages Taipei from taking any action that would trigger Beijing to kind of invade or to utilize its military to punish Taiwan. And so this is called strategic ambiguity. Ever since 2020, there's been a rising chorus among certain aspects of the DC establishment to revise this decades-long policy of strategic ambiguity to something called strategic clarity. So this is a op-ed in Foreign Affairs by the president of the Council for Foreign Relations, Richard Haass. So this is a major political scientist who has major voice within the foreign policy establishment, who's argued that it's important for the United States to state clearly that it will defend Taiwan against Beijing's aggression, and that this serves the United States better than ambiguity because Beijing might calculate that maybe the US will hesitate. And so there's this argument for clarity. I should make clear that many within the DC establishment, including many within think tanks, and probably within the State Department as well, do not buy into this. I think that they are still quite pro-strategic ambiguity. And this is one of the kind of white papers. This is a very long 40-page report written by Blackwell and Zelikow, still arguing that ambiguity makes a lot of sense within the current political environment, has served the United States well in the past 4 or 5 decades, and should still continue to serve the United States well. Nonetheless, I think that this argument for clarity is being picked up in certain places, especially in Congress. The US Congress is very pro-Taiwan. It's more pro-Taiwan, I think, than any arm of the US government. This is partially because these are elected lawmakers, and so they have to care about their elections, and Taiwan is a popular bipartisan issue. Both Republicans and Democrats kind of find that they poll well when they support Taiwan. So you'll see that in certain aspects of US Congress, senators and congressmen have said publicly that they should end strategic ambiguity. I think the more conservative aspect of the US government is in the executive branch. So in the Biden administration and in the State Department are more pro status quo. You also have outside parties. So this was an op-ed penned by the now deceased Shinzo Abe, who argued that the United States should pursue a policy of strategic clarity to outline that it would defend Taiwan against China's invasion. Of course, Abe was a member of the very right wing, the conservative wing of the LDP in Japan, which is kind of their most nationalistic wing and has been very aggressively anti-China. Okay, final aspect, we'll talk about defense. So there's so much being talked about in terms of the potential for military action for invasion. And Taiwan, historically, in the past 2 decades or so, has not really had much, has not had a great reputation in terms of its military. It doesn't invest a whole lot in its military. And it doesn't have a very good reputation in terms of its morale, preparedness, equipment, et cetera, et cetera. This is very recent news, August 24th, that we have a significant increase in defense spending. I mean, 14% may not sound like a whole lot, but this is the largest year upon year increase in defense spending in Taiwan since probably since the martial law era. So this is a major change. The United States has a relationship with Taiwan that's outlined within the Taiwan Relations Act, which was passed by Congress in 1979, signed into law. And the TRA doesn't do a whole lot, but what it has especially outlined very clearly is the United States shall make available to Taiwan such defense articles and defense services in such quantity as may be necessary to enable Taiwan to maintain a sufficient self-defense capacity. So meaning that the United States has an obligation. It is very interesting, yeah. So it basically says the United States has an obligation. It's set in law. It has to sell defense
Never
arms.
mind, I got to do exercise too, but I want to listen.
Yeah, so this is important for what is kind of outlined in terms of the history of US-Taiwan relations. Every presidential administration since 1979, since Jimmy Carter, has sold arms to Taiwan. The Biden administration has an arms package being sold to Taiwan right now, which includes HIMARS, which is now very popular because of Ukraine. And there is currently a law that's being discussed. It's just left the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, called the Taiwan Policy Act, which actually is the largest revision to Taiwan policy in 50 years, since 1979, because it modifies this specific clause by giving Taiwan even more arms. So it modifies this aspect of self-defense capacity, doing away with that, saying that the United States can sell any kinds of arms to Taiwan. So this is a significant change if it passes Congress. The United States has for many years told Taiwan that it needs to increase its defense spending. So this is an article from Richard Bush, who used to be basically the ambassador to Taiwan. He was the head of the AIT. And so I think that now that the invasion of Ukraine, Taiwan's politics are finally shifting, that we're seeing people in Taiwan who mostly, I would say maybe before 2021, were very skeptical of the military and need for a military for very obvious reasons. They suffered under 40 years under a military dictatorship, and the military was an arm of the government that enforced basically martial law. And so I think that the general public is now shifting their perspectives that the military can actually do good for Taiwan, can actually help defend against a significant threat to its existence. So I mentioned this earlier, this is the Taiwan Policy Act. So it's just passed, September 15th has just passed the Foreign Relations Committee from the Senate. So I think this is something that we should keep an eye out for, because as I mentioned, the TRA has not changed in 50 years. And for that commitment for the United States to sell defense arms to be modified in this fashion, is a very large change. And I think that there are some people who are saying that it's too large of a change. It's one that will undoubtedly anger Beijing, and who knows what that might lead to. As I mentioned earlier, though, Congress is very, very pro-Taiwan. And I expect that once it leaves the Foreign Relations Committee, which it has, and it goes up for votes in the full floor, we're going to see something like this. This is the Taipei Act of 2019, which was a 415-0 vote. So nobody opposed this act that's basically called for increased ties with Taiwan. And I expect that once the Taiwan Policy Act goes to a vote, we'll see a result like this. So it's going to be up to the Biden administration to perhaps try to temper expectations and to shift the policy towards something that may be a little bit less revisionist, but we'll see. Okay, that ends my section.
So earlier, we had a question sent. I had a question that was sent to me in the chat from about speaking of China, watching the Ukraine now. Do you think the 2014 Sunflower Movement was influenced by the 2013-14 Maidan uprising in the Ukraine?
Yeah, so I think there has been some scholarship about kind of like the early 2010s kind of different social uprisings, whether it's Maidan or whether it's Arab Spring, the Sunflower Movement, and later on the Umbrella Movement in Hong Kong. I don't think that, certainly social movements today are different than they were historically because they're run through social media. They're in a world where they're very aware about political circumstances in other societies. But I think that the main kind of trigger point for the Sunflower Movement, as well as the reasons why it became such a mass movement, are not kind of dealing with other comparative contexts. It was very much about the very specific black box process. So what was perceived as an attack upon a very important and precious democratic institution, which is the legislative yuan, basically how laws are passed in Taiwan. And because the source of that attack, which was perceived as the Kuomintang, the Nationalist Party's increased kind of secret friendliness with Beijing. And there were lots of speculation about how Beijing has utilized different means of influence, economic as well as kind of dark money influence, in order to encourage the Nationalist Party to pass certain laws to increase ties with China. And so I think that was one of the reasons why the Sunflower Movement was so widespread, is because having the combination of an attack upon a democratic institution, which I think in Taiwan most young people highly value because they're taught about martial law, they're taught about the authoritarian period in school, and they see democracy as something that was hard earned and hard fought for, and the combination of that with the influence from China, which most young people I think in Taiwan are very skeptical of Beijing and have largely a negative opinion about Beijing's motivations.
Thank you, Professor Lin. The next question I've got here from Christopher. He's referring to the graph you had shown in your slides in relation to that graph of the increase in people identifying as Taiwanese. Is there a growing or strong Indigenous peoples movement and talk of reparations, sovereignty, language teaching, land exchange, etc.?
Yeah, I really like this question because Indigenous peoples in Taiwan have, of course, just like here in Washington in the United States, have historically been discriminated against, marginalized, assimilated into cultures which are not theirs, and their lands have been taken away from them. So there, just like here, there are movements to help kind of repatriate land, to build again linguistic fluency in terms of all of the different indigenous languages, to protect indigenous culture. They're also kind of economically tend to be very disadvantaged. They live in poor areas. areas that sometimes are neglected by the government, more prone to natural disasters, less likely to receive investment. And so I think that there is kind of just like the political spectrum here in the United States, that there is a kind of progressive wing within Taiwanese politics of people who are seeking to, I guess, to use their language to ally themselves with indigenous movements and to help kind of lift up those priorities within the government. Obviously, they still face a large number of obstacles, developers, other forms of politics that take priority over theirs. There's still a very small number. 2% of indigenous peoples are, sorry, 2% of Taiwanese are indigenous peoples. Very many of them are not politically active because they're in rural areas because they tend to be poor. But I think that Taiwan is kind of doing well in terms of paying attention to this. There have been recent changes in, for example, the education system, where depending on where your school district is located, school children can take optional language courses. I mean, mandatory, like kind of second language courses, but the second language offerings are actually quite diverse. So if you're in a region that has a significant Hakka population, Hakka courses are offered. If you're very recently, demographic change has focused around so-called new immigrants, which are mostly from Southeast Asia. So especially Vietnamese, many Taiwanese men have been taking Vietnamese wives. And so there are a number of children who are half Vietnamese. And so in areas where there's a large Vietnamese population, like Taoyuan, there are Vietnamese courses that you can take as your second language course. In the indigenous areas, each of the indigenous areas tends to have their own local indigenous language as a course offering, which I think is really good for the Taiwanese government to support. And I hope there continues to be improvement. Oh, I'm also aware that there is, kind of like increased global solidarity. So, indigenous peoples in Taiwan are also making connections with, even here locally, that there have been events. One of our Jackson School alumni, Michael Jacobson, is very much involved with this, where he's organizing Taiwanese indigenous groups to visit Pacific Northwest indigenous tribes and to have exchanges around, not just politics, but also like culture, music. And last year we had a performance, was it Small Island Big Music? I forgot the specific title, but it was set up by our new arts and culture program within the Taiwan Studies program. And so this was also one of these transnational indigenous performances where there are indigenous performers from different indigenous communities around the world, from the South Pacific, from I cannot recall exactly, but I think there were 5 or 6 different communities and different performers performing together as one group. So there are instances like that, and I think that's it's really nice for Taiwan to have that solidarity.
Thank you. Our next question we have from Brenda. If you could look 50 years into the future, what do you think might be the situation at that time?
I have no idea. I'm sorry. Not a clue. 50 years in the future, most historians are very reluctant to make any kind of predictions. I mean, maybe like 5 years might be something that some people might be willing to venture a guess into. 50 years, no idea. I don't think people 50 years ago, if you asked them what 2022 would look like, I don't think any of them would have gotten it right. So unfortunately, I'm not the right person to ask. Sorry.
Thank you. For the next question I have from Kimberly. I have 2 colleagues who identify as Taiwanese American with close ties to their heritage. When I invited them to speak to my students about Taiwan, they expressed deep fear of potential repercussions from Chinese parents. They also cautioned me to avoid the topic altogether, lest the school face protests from the Chinese community. We are in a school in California in a dense Asian populated area. What advice would you offer in terms of leading a discussion with US 12th graders about current Taiwanese issues?
Yeah, this is a very interesting question. I'm aware of some of how kind of social media networks have created certain kinds of communities within, particularly within like kind of Chinese diasporic areas. One of the articles I mentioned in the handout is written by Malin Mayer, who has looked at kind of, I think his article is from 2020 maybe, about parents organizing in the Bellevue School District. But that was about testing, standardized testing. But we also know that the networks through which they organize, which is primarily through WeChat, is very powerful and has created a powerful political constituency in local politics. We've also seen this within the San Francisco, the school, I'm sorry, the recall campaign for the San Francisco district attorney, which is also partially organized from WeChat communities. So this is certainly an important thing to keep an eye out for. I don't really know exactly, kind of the best advice to give. I would say that, like the Taiwan Studies program at the University of Washington does not receive any kind of political pressure. And that's because I think, well, I don't know for sure, but I'd like to think one of the reasons why that's the case is because we really try to focus on the academic issue of Taiwan studies. We're not a political advocacy organization. And I think that within the classroom, the right way to present Taiwan in a diverse school curriculum is not about political advocacy, but rather about giving voice to a community that historically hasn't always had a voice. And I think framed that way, if we frame it that way, that's the right way to frame it. I don't think that's as problematic for certain aspects of the diaspora community. Just kind of personal experience as an educator and also personal experience as a member of that diaspora. I think that there's a difference between exerting kind of a political opinion that others find as an attack upon their own versus an expression of a kind of identity and a kind of inclusion within a curriculum. And I think that we want to aim for the latter. So I think it's kind of difficult because there's a fine line in the case of Taiwan between the former and the latter. But I think it's possible. I think that to be very specific, if you want to invite the colleagues, Taiwanese American colleagues, I think that the way to do it is probably to kind of discuss what it's like being Taiwanese American if you're talking about kind of Asian American history or Asian American culture, and just to have a space for what does it mean to be Taiwanese American without necessarily making it about like Taiwan versus China, which I think is probably a more incisive way to frame that. And I think that avoiding kind of contemporary headlines is also a good way to, we don't want to frame this as kind of a reaction to headlines, even though that's the topic of our of our discussion today. I think that we want to frame it as in, this is a long-standing kind of more marginalized community within Asian American communities, and it's something that we should include within a diverse curriculum.
Okay, thank you. The next question, Christopher is asking whether you could talk a little bit about Taiwanese policy toward North and South Korea.
North and South Korea is not a particularly large concern for Taiwan foreign policy. For obvious reasons, Taiwan's foreign policy is centered around, it's mostly around challenges to its own existence, that it's not a member of most international organizations. And so it's really centered around getting membership to the WHO, to the United Nations, and lots of other things become deprioritized in that aspect. If you want to take more of a cynical view, I think it could be considered like, will this help Taiwan for us to get involved in other sorts of conflicts? And so North and South Korea, I think that the Taiwanese foreign policy establishment probably sees as kind of not really beneficial for Taiwan to get involved in. South Korea is more of a concern because it is an important regional player. South Korea also, I think, sees itself as South Korea has very significant economic ties with China. And so it also has significant economic ties with Taiwan. And so I think it likes to play kind of like a neutral kind of party. It doesn't like to get involved in Taiwan issues. And so I think that the Taiwan-South Korean relationship is mostly based on one of let's build some economic ties and make money together, and then we leave the politics aside.
Okay, thank you. Let's see. So last week in our series, we had a talk on North and South Korea. And so Christopher is mentioning here, so in that talk, there had been mentioning about people on both sides wanting some form of reunification. They both had different views on what that would look like. Is there a large or majority of people who would like some form of reunification or normalization, albeit under different ways forward? Or is it pretty clear that the majority wants to keep it separate, even with the tension and potential for danger?
Yeah, so the Taiwan relationship with China is slightly different from the North and South Korean relationship because Taiwanese and Chinese are free to travel between both countries. You can hop on a plane, buy a ticket. You have to get a visa, but the visa is largely a formality. You're not going to get denied unless you're like a Taiwanese political activist, or unless you're like Chinese military. You're not going to get denied a visa. Also, there's just been, ever since the 1980s, there's been a very close relationship in terms of economic ties, like I mentioned. There's a group of people called, colloquially known as Taishang, short for Taiwanese businessmen, who live full-time. They live full-time in China. And at some points in the 2010s, this was about 1 million people, 1 million Taiwanese living full-time in China. Their children born and raised there. So I think that shows the kind of that ties in some ways are actually quite close, and the so-called kind of normalization between North and South Korea in Taiwan and China's case has actually been achieved. It was achieved in the 1990s. In terms of unification, that's a very different story. So if we look at the polling, going back to that chart I mentioned from National Zhenjiang University's Election Study Center, they do 2 major polls. One is on identity, the one that you saw. The other is about political perspectives towards cross-strait relations. And they ask, do you want to maintain the status quo? Do you want immediate independence? Do you want immediate unification? Or do you want status quo and then eventually independence, status quo and eventually unification? So the 2 questions, immediate unification or status quo and then unification, those polling numbers are extremely low, I think around less than 5%. So that tells you that unification is very unpopular in Taiwan, and over time has become more and more unpopular. I think the perspective of wanting immediate unification, so kind of what this question gets at, is considered a fringe political position in Taiwan, really fringe. I mean, like kind of like QAnon equivalent fringe in the United States. I think if you were to express that, you would get very similar reactions in a mainstream political context in Taiwan. It's largely isolated to people of a certain generation and a certain background. They come from the so-called mainlander families and likely would be over the age of 50. And so that's a very particular demographic that is both, I don't want to say dying, but it's shrinking because obviously that demographic ages. Younger Taiwanese do not have, I don't think that number even polls. There is nobody under the age of 50 virtually. There's nobody that supports unification.
Thank you. The next question I have here from Brenda. Taiwanese businessmen and diplomats during the apartheid era in South Africa were classified as honorary whites for trade purposes. Were there any other countries in the past who have dealt with Taiwan as having a special status? Although obviously not racially based, compared to PRC Chinese trade representatives.
Yeah, there's a wonderful book. It's very academic, so it's not maybe the easiest to read, but there's a wonderful book about Taiwan and South Africa under the apartheid and even early post-apartheid era by Gillian Hart, a geographer at Berkeley. I forget the globalization as it was published in the 2000s. She's published a number of books, so I should remember that particular title. But it talks about Taiwanese businessmen in South Africa. And, you know, one of the reasons why they were so privileged is because there's a bit of history involved. Apartheid South Africa and the authoritarian martial law Republic of China were both marginalized, internationally marginalized regimes because of their human rights records, both seen as being very, very poor, obviously for very obvious reasons because of apartheid and because of the White Terror. And they found a kind of solidarity with each other. This is a history that Taiwan does not like to remember because this was a previous authoritarian regime that found solidarity with another very bad regime. When South Africa was transitioning out of apartheid, the white ruling class nonetheless privileged Taiwanese businessmen because one, they brought in capital to a country that was largely marginalized internationally because of apartheid. And so the Taiwanese were willing to come in. And two, they had lots of capital because this was after the 1980s economic miracle. Third was also because the Taiwanese were kind of looking for cheap labor markets, and they couldn't get into, I mean, Southeast Asia, yes, for sure, Southeast Asia was nearby, and Taiwanese had been there ever since the Deng Xiaoping era. But Africa was really cheap, especially South Africa, for obvious apartheid reasons. So they came in, and the immediate post-apartheid kind of economic environment was that of neoliberalism, basically allow these Taiwanese businessmen to basically take advantage of our labor. As low as those labor costs can be, we're going to get rid of any kind of labor protection laws, any environmental protection. You can do whatever you want as long as you set up a factory here. And this might be a familiar story for people talking about China in Africa today, or the United States and China in the 2000s, et cetera, et cetera. It's a very common story. So to go back to your question about, are there any other countries that have dealt with Taiwan having a special status? I would say that this is probably the more unique one because of how, you know, the unique politics of South Africa and Taiwan were linked together. There have been other cases too. You know, Taiwan has had a close, ever since the 80s, it's had a close relationship with a few Latin American countries, Costa Rica, previously Nicaragua until they were poached away. I believe it was Paraguay or Uruguay. Paraguay, I think, continues to maintain diplomatic relations with Taiwan. Some of these are because of kind of historical circumstances that the ROC has built over decades close political ties. And so they do have kind of, Taiwanese do kind of have a special relationship, but not like kind of like honorary whites, because that has a very specific racial context in South Africa. One that I think most Taiwanese, they may not know about it, but if they do, they should be embarrassed about it.
Thank you. Just one second here. So our next question, Taiwan doesn't have an agreement like Hong Kong about ownership or governance reverting to China. Correct, she's asking. So is it simply, Janai is asking, so is it simply China's insistence that Taiwan belongs to it that has dominated the narrative? Also, why didn't Mao immediately go after the KMT when it fled to Taiwan if it considered it to be part of China? Why did he allow them to carry on there for generations?
Yeah, all good questions. I see in the comments that Christy has pasted the title of the book that by Gillian Hart. Thank you, Christy. That is the correct book, Disabling Globalization. Like I mentioned, it's kind of academic, but one of my favorite books. Okay, so back to the question. Yes, Taiwan does not have an agreement. We have to recall that Taiwan was not administered by a colonial government like the United Kingdom. So Hong Kong, actually, I think probably, in the 2022, we now know that that was not the right move. Hong Kongers were not given voice about their own future. They were handed back from one colonial government into what we now know to be another colonial government in Beijing. So this is a situation that most Hong Kongers will believe to be very tragic, and I happen to agree. So yes, it's simply China's insistence that Taiwan belongs to it, and this is a narrative that they've pushed somewhat successfully, I think, internationally. That they've said over and over again that Taiwan is part of China, and if you don't agree, we will exercise some sort of pressure to make you agree. Why didn't Mao immediately go after the KMT? He tried to. So there were the first Strait Crisis, 1958, was the PLA, the People's Liberation Army invasion of an outlying island that was controlled by the Republic of China called Jingmen, also known as Quemoy. And when Chiang Kai-shek, when the KMT fled, it held not just Taiwan, but also a couple of these tiny little islands that are just offshore, really close to CCP controlled territory. Jingmen is 1,000 meters, 1 kilometer. You could swim across. In fact, there have been people who swum across that stretch of land. That stretch of water. During the 90s, during liberalization, there were ferries, and I've taken the ferry across. It's only an hour to a major Chinese city of Xiamen. So in the 50s, the PLA landed on Quemoy and attempted to take it. And this was seen as kind of a stepping stone, the first stage of an eventual invasion of Taiwan. Historians have now looked at declassified documents, and I think that the consensus is that Mao had a number of considerations. One is that the PLA could very likely have taken Jingmen successfully at a very high cost. It was heavily fortified by the ROC. That's because Chiang Kai-shek knew that in order to invade Taiwan, they had to first go through that island. And so it was extremely heavily fortified, artillery, naval support, everything. The second is that even if Mao was able to take that first island, that was 1,000 meters, 1 kilometer away. Taiwan is about 110, 160, something like that. To carry out full-fledged amphibious assault on Taiwan in the 1950s, when the PLA Navy was basically just a merchant marine force, would have been extremely difficult. Not to mention that the nationalist government had then mined basically every potential landing spot and had put in, basically coastal defense that would have made any kind of landing probably suicide. So this would have been extremely difficult. It was made easier over time, 1970s, when Mao, the PLA Air Force began to be developed, so you had air power behind that. But nonetheless, amphibious assaults, even until today, 2022, there are military experts that debate whether or not the PLA Navy has significant amphibious assault capability. And so it's very much a matter of geography and military capability, that even if Mao wanted to do it, he probably couldn't have. And then there's the question I hinted at earlier, which is that Mao probably could have taken Jingmen. Why didn't he? And that's because Mao considered Jingmen to be more useful as a nationalist symbol, meaning that whenever we have issues with, we need to kind of, what's the phrase? We need to kind of rattle our sabers and beat the drums of war. What's extremely useful is you can just tell your artillery to fire upon Jingmen and say, we are doing our part in keeping the imperialists out of China and doing our part to reunify, to take Taiwan back from the lackeys of the Western imperialists, which is what they call the KMT. So there's a useful political symbol in keeping the KMT independent and leaving them there in Taiwan. And then there's the very kind of realist perspective that it's very difficult to take back Taiwan.
Thank you. Our next question is a little bit related. If China were to push for control over Taiwan, would it just mean a return to a Taiwan pre-1980s or a more radical upheaval of governmental identity?
I assume the question means if like what China is telling the rest of the world it would do if it were to take over Taiwan. I assume that's.
Yes, Kimberly's clarified here in terms of totalitarian.
Oh, okay, I'll answer this two ways. I'll answer this kind of in terms of how China is saying it will do it, and then how maybe we can kind of assume what might happen. So the Beijing narrative is that it will offer Taiwan something along the lines of what it's offered Hong Kong, one country, two systems. Taiwan recognizes that it's a part of China. It passes over full control of its military and foreign policy to Beijing. In exchange, it will operate under its own political system and its own economic system separately from Beijing, much like Hong Kong has after 1997. This was the offer that was made during the 1990s and throughout the 2000s to Taiwan. And at that point, I think it was a little bit, there was a little bit of kind of attraction behind it. Today, after 2019, after the Hong Kong national security law, I think that nobody in Taiwan believes that one country, two systems is a real offer. Beijing, when it made the one country, two systems agreement with the treaty with the United Kingdom in 1997 with the retrocession of Hong Kong, that was a 50-year guarantee. 50 years in terms of how Beijing thinks. I mean, this is kind of a stereotype, but I think it's largely accurate. Beijing has acted, ever since 1949, has acted very long-term in terms of how it plans its foreign policy. 50 years is nothing. That's 2 generations. 1997 was 25 years ago. That's not a lot of time. And it's essentially fully reneged upon that agreement for one country, two systems. And it's taken away all currency, all credibility it has in that offer to Taiwan. And that tells us a lot. I wrote an op-ed for The Guardian about this. It tells us that Beijing cares a lot about its control over Hong Kong. It sees the Hong Kong protests as a much greater existential threat for it to modify something that was, I think most people believe, was largely favorable to Beijing, an agreement that said after 50 years, you can do whatever you want and nobody will say anything. And I think that part of why there's so much sympathy for the Hong Kong protests is because of, that was a guarantee that was made and then reneged upon. So that is kind of what was on the table for Taiwan. I think it still is kind of on the table, even though it's not really, it has no force behind it. In terms of hypothetically what would happen if there were control over Taiwan, I think it would essentially be pre-1980s. I think it would be like 1947 kind of control, because I don't see Taiwanese people as taking this very much like, kind of nonchalantly. I think that there will be a great deal of resistance. I don't know if it's going to be like Ukraine resistance, where you have, literally resistance fighters, fighting guns against an occupying force. But certainly I think it's going to be at least like Hong Kong, if not more.
Thank you. Brenda has posted this question. Do any Taiwanese opt for PRC citizenship? If so, are there any statistics and what penalties, if any, are incurred? Likewise, are any PRC Chinese allowed to relocate permanently to Taiwan?
Yeah, so the PRC has a very specific kind of, it's a visa/passport That's called neither, because obviously China considers Taiwanese to be domestic citizens. So it's called a Taibaozhen, which translates to a Taiwanese comrade identification. And the Taibaozhen gives, if you apply for it as a Taiwanese citizen, you actually gain a number of privileges within China that's normally not offered to foreigners. I believe it grants you certain kinds of welfare benefits, but also gives you the ability to purchase real estate, which is something that's not given to foreigners at all. And so there is this kind, you do see kind of aspects of that one country, two systems offer. It was meant to be the so-called carrot approach, that Taiwanese would be incentivized, enticed to kind of rejoin Beijing's sphere of influence through economic incentives. The Taibaozhen is one of these, kind of symbols. And all of the Taishan, the Taiwanese businessmen I mentioned who are living in Taiwan, sorry, in China, they have the Taiwanese comrade, or Taiwanese compatriot is the right term, Taiwanese compatriot identification. So they hold these forms of legal documentation. So that was fairly, it worked fairly well up until about 2016, I would say, when relations between Beijing and Taipei became really quite hostile. Young people in Taiwan, actually, many of them, there's a so-called brain drain issue. And historically, brain drain has been from Taiwan to the United States, because immigration since the 1970s has allowed for Taiwanese to immigrate to the United States. But because of the kind of cultural and language similarity, you already know Mandarin, you don't have to learn English. You can go and work in Shanghai and kind of double your salary as a young person in Taiwan in the 2010s. And many Taiwanese took that option. They got their Taiwanese compatriot identification. They went to work in Shanghai for many years. That's increasingly rare these days, because many Taiwanese feel as if they are kind of marginalized within Chinese society, and also because Beijing as a government is very hostile to Taiwan. And so just anecdotally, I think I knew a number of people who are in Shanghai. I think it's just a small handful, and they're only academics, people who basically don't earn a lot of money in Taiwan, barely above minimum wage. I think that's one of the reasons why they're choosing to work in Shanghai, where they can get probably about 3 to 4 times their salary. I think other young people are not interested. Most of them have come back to Taiwan, even though they're essentially sacrificing the 50% raise.
Okay, thank you. Earlier, Professor Lin, in one of your slides, you had an article by from Prime Minister Abe, and if I could sort of ask a question related to that. In our series, we also have a program on Japan, and I'm sure his death will come up during that program. So after he was shot and killed, I had read about flags at half-staff in Taiwan, and there was I think Taiwan was one of the first places where there was expressions of mourning. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about that.
Yeah, if I have a second, I'll Google the image later. In Taipei, if you've been to Taiwan, there's a big building called Taipei 101. It's seen visible from almost anywhere in Taiwan, because it's just a massive skyscraper. Taipei 101 is a large symbol of kind of public sentiment. This is where sometimes you'll see messages. During the COVID pandemic, there was kind of a message of like, we'll get through this together. New Year's Eve, there's a huge fireworks show there that attracts massive crowds in Taipei, and it just locks up all traffic for hours. When Shinzo Abe passed, there was a message on Taipei 101 that said, something like "Rest in peace, Prime Minister Abe," and that's a major message of solidarity for a foreign politician. I don't recall seeing anything like that for a I don't recall seeing any politician be celebrated that way, not even like a popular Taiwanese politician like Li Denghui. Shinzo Abe is very popular in Taiwan, and he's popular for a number of reasons. One is he's been very pro-Taiwan, and that's part of his politics as the conservative wing, the LDP. Um, One of their policies, very troubling policies, is nostalgia, not just nostalgia, but praise for the Japanese Empire. And they see Taiwan as like the crown jewel that, this is what the Japanese Empire did for the world. It created a modern society in Taiwan. And they take claim for that. They say that, Taiwan was turned from backwater colony into modern nation state because of Japanese imperial policies. And many of the right-wing LDP political commentators, politicians like Abe, then feel this affinity for Taiwan because they claim Taiwan is their own. And part of that is then expressed within contemporary domestic politics, that because Taiwan is one of our colonies, it's a prized jewel of the Japanese Empire, which to them kind of still exists in spirit, troublingly. And so they have these really aggressive pro-Taiwan policies, almost like kind of like, we want to pass a Taiwan Relations Act that dictates that we will come to Taiwan's defense in the event of invasion. The other aspect of the LDP foreign policy is anti-China. That it sees China as a rival rising power. It sees it as the main enemy in kind of global geopolitics. And one of the ways in which that's aligned then is, Taiwan is an innocent target of this evil empire in China. And so Taiwan then is become very favored. There's the whole other aspect of Taiwanese nostalgia for Japanese colonialism. So it's not just a one-way relationship between the conservative LDP and an imagined Taiwan. Many Taiwanese of a certain generation, so people like Lee Teng-hui, who was one of major political figure, he was Taiwan's first freely elected president. He grew up under Japanese colonial rule at the very tail end, and was one of the first public figures post-democratization to publicly say, like, I identify as partially as Japanese. And this was a position that was repressed under KMT rule, and the KMT said that the Japanese were kind of evil colonizers, that they had brainwashed and kind of taken Taiwanese off the path of civilization. And so they were demonized within curriculum for many decades. And so for Lee Teng-hui to say that very publicly, one, it created a very strong backlash, especially among people who are pro-KMT. But two, it created a strong feeling of affinity among people who had been repressed for so long. And so pro-Japanese sentiment became kind of synonymous with decolonization. That this opinion, we weren't able to express it for 40 years, and now we are able to express it. And so many people kind of rallied to that flag, that they kind of took up this position of pro-Japanese sentiments because of how they perceived it was so important for how new Taiwanese identity was being expressed, that they could say something like that. And I think that continues in part. You see that pro-Japanese sentiment is quite mainstream in Taiwan because of that complicated history.
Thank you. Thank you for answering that spontaneously. Christy.
Yeah, I have a quick question I wanted to ask you, James. I think about in June, there were several articles talking about people who had left Hong Kong, sort of political refugees, leaving Hong Kong to immigrate to Taiwan. And in June, there were all these articles about how that was not really, suddenly they're being worried that they were spies and things like that. Can you talk just a little bit about that situation?
Yeah, so I think it touches upon a number of themes. One is Hong Kongers coming to Taiwan are touching upon kind of almost like a xenophobic strain of Taiwanese nationalism. I wouldn't say xenophobic, but certainly nativist. and certainly nationalistic, where one, I think that there are people who tend to be very, very far on the scale of pro-Taiwan. When you get to the extreme end, it goes away from kind of just about being pro-Taiwan, and it goes into nationalism, Taiwanese nationalism. And I think when you get into that very far end of nationalism, it then also picks up on nativism and xenophobia, where Taiwan is for the Taiwanese and it's not for anyone else. Hong Kongers coming to Taiwan, they carry PRC passports. And, I think that Taiwanese people, some people, I would say most people understand that they are a group of people who felt repressed under Chinese rule and do not identify with Beijing and identify as Hong Kongers and not Chinese. So that's the logical interpretation. But some people, there's a small segment of the Taiwanese population that sees Hong Kongers as the nationality on their passport. And even if they may not sympathize with the Beijing government, which I think is a very logical conclusion, they say that, among these so-called refugees, some of them might be Beijing spies who are masquerading as Hong Kongers. Of course, it's very silly because Hong Kongers have a very distinct kind of characteristics. One, they don't speak Mandarin well. Two, they speak Hong Kong Cantonese, which is very difficult to learn, has all sorts of colloquialisms and idiomatic expressions that are very, very difficult for a non-speaker to pick up, even people who specifically study this. And three, if people from Beijing want to come to Taiwan, they could do so without being Hong Kongers, because you don't have to be a refugee to come to Taiwan. So it's really silly on multiple levels. And I think it's kind of disappointing to see that kind of nativist kind of reaction. Thankfully, I think most people I know are not like that. Unfortunately, there's also on the other end, many Hong Kongers coming to Taiwan initially had Taiwan in the Hong Kong imagination has a very positive image. It's kind of like also the society that suffers from Beijing. It's also Chinese speaking. It's also kind of former colony. But when they come to Taiwan, I think they feel a certain amount of alienation, because even though Taiwan suffers under Beijing's existential threat, they don't suffer in the same way that Hong Kong does. Hong Kong deals on a daily basis with agents of Beijing, with literal police forces that physically assault them. Taiwanese people do not have that. They have the luxury of not being ruled by Beijing. And so there's a lot of, I think, difference in their experiences. Many Hong Kongers probably are thinking of, kind of like this ideal paradise, and their actual interactions are not quite like that. Taiwan is still a very different society from Hong Kong. The language barrier is also quite real. When you speak a Cantonese accented Mandarin, it's not quite, you don't quite fit into Taiwanese society. There's still all sorts of customs that are quite different between Hong Kong and Taiwan. And I think that some Hong Kongers are feeling a little bit of difficulty with that, which is why, like probably the most popular destinations for Hong Kongers remains the United Kingdom and Canada. And I think that, those numbers probably won't change, even though there's a sizable and growing Hong Kong population in Taiwan.
Thank you. So there was one question that was sent to me. Would you be able to speak a little bit about how Taiwan's history is taught in schools in Taiwan? For example, is the White Terror, how is that taught at all, or how?
Yeah. So ever since democratization, there have been a series of educational reforms. So like the United States, curriculum is standardized. So the government determines, for example, what kinds of textbooks are allowed to be purchased in schools. And so starting at the 2000s with Chen Shui-bian's administration, Chen Shui-bian is the first DPP president, so the first very pro-Taiwan president, began to make mandatory in education curriculum teaching of the White Terror, teaching of February 28th, which is not just within school curriculum, but also is within public history. So, there's the commemoration of February 28th as in the day, so that anniversary. There is commemoration of February 28th within transitional justice and human rights discourse, and also within public spaces. So there's a 228 Memorial Park. There's a Jingmei Human Rights Museum, which discusses the human rights abuses under the White Terror. There's a 228 Memorial Museum. And so the government has really made sure to include knowledge of the White Terror period within not just education, but also across kind of public education for the entirety of Taiwanese society. And there have been some controversies where, those who are more pro-KMT, who say that some reforms have gone too far, that, kind of it borders on kind of political as opposed to educational. So there have been debates about that in the past couple of decades about whether this is something that really should be part of the education. But today I would say that that standard is very much teaching Taiwanese history and teaching about the excesses and the human rights violations under the authoritarian period. And this is one of the reasons why I think the Sunflower Movement, why you had such a turnout from the youth, is that this is the generation that had first gone through mandatory education about the authoritarian period. And so they understand quite well about what, I guess, democratic backsliding might look like. And this is the reason why they value democracy.
Thank you. And I have one more question that I have here. Speaking of, democracy and conversations, do you know of any opportunities for American teachers and students to connect with Taiwanese schools, teachers and students? It'd be interesting to have a virtual conversation or engage in some collaborative projects and conversations.
That's a really good question. I don't know personally. I think Christy might know. I would say that in Taiwan, there is an immense demand for internationalization, and especially with English speaking, and especially with US counterparts, that Taiwanese schools, teachers, and students really love kind of educational exchanges with, especially with American teachers and students. The Taiwan Studies program gets requests all the time from the University of Taiwan. But I think on like a K through 16 level, I think they'd be very happy. I feel like, Christy, if you know Vicky, Vicky Shi.
There's actually an initiative right now
Okay.
from the Taiwan Economic and Cultural Organization, from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. But they're starting in specific states, interestingly. So they're starting a correspondence between Montana and Colorado right now. So I don't know who asked that question or where you're from, but contact me and we can figure out a way to get you connected, because definitely this is something that Taiwan teachers and schools and students are interested in.
I would
Thanks,
add,
James.
yeah, I would add that even if you don't go through like an official program, so I think the TICA one would be like an official program. When it's official, they make everything easier. They take care of all the logistics for you. But informally, I bet if you're not eligible for an official program, I bet that Vicky Shi could probably make connections with someone. Our local Seattle TICO office doesn't have a Ministry of Education. The Ministry of Education office is based out of the San Francisco TICO office. So maybe Vicky can make that connection, and I'm sure many people, many schools, many teachers would be willing to informally, outside the confines of official program, do some kind of unofficial exchange. And because of kind of Zoom, we can all do it virtually. So I would be very optimistic that this could happen.
I would concur. So please just contact me. I can set you up with Vicky and we can make that work out. I know we can.
Yeah, thank you. Did we have, thank you. Did we have any more final questions before we, yeah, I think
Great. Yep.
we
Yep.
asked all our questions.
Perfect.
So yes, and to those of you who might have joined late, this talk is being recorded, has been recorded, it will be uploaded. So you will receive a link if you'd like to watch parts of it. And also Professor Lin has kindly offered to share his slides. So that will be available later. And that's all for me.
Please join us next week for our talk.
Hong Kong.
Hong Kong. Yeah, I was like, thank you. And thank you so much, Professor Lin. So wonderful to see you and learn from you. I really appreciate your time, and it was a great talk. So thank you. And thank you all for making time. And we'll see you again next week.
Thank you all.
Bye.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.